social emotional learning consultant. I am a teacher, I'm a parent, and just by way of a brief introduction, because I know some people have obviously been here before, I stepped out of the classroom a few years ago to work in this field. And this is something that I've always been really passionate about, and the more I was in education, the more passionate I became about this work, because after teaching 5th grade, 3rd grade, and going down to pre-K, I felt like there was something missing in our broader educational system, and the problems, the issues, the challenges that I would see with kids as they got older were things that I felt like, wow, could we address them as parents, as educators? How could we support our children as they grow through the years so that some of the issues that we face as they get older perhaps wouldn't be as much of an issue as they are. And so to the extent that we can inoculate children, we can give them a little dose of a vaccine so that potentially the things that the vaccinations are there for a reason. In the same way, social emotional learning and this area of education is there for that reason as well. It's there to support our children as they grow and to build their capacity so that they don't, or that they have the skills and the tools they need to support themselves as they get older. So it's really talking about the other half of the report card and supporting our children as they grow through the years. So I'm really excited to be here. Social emotional learning is a really big field, and so when we were talking about how to kind of break this down and talk about it as parents, as teachers, one of the things that we really want to start with, what we thought about would be a good way to start, is with this idea of one of the pieces, which is self-awareness. So I'm going to backtrack, because that was the video, but that comes later. Okay, so first of all, maybe just by a brief way of introduction, maybe we can just go around again and I know we started this last time, but just to share our names, maybe the ages of our children or child or children, just to get a sense of where everybody is in this bigger picture of parenthood. Go ahead.
I'm Devin, and my daughter's 6 in 1st grade.
I'm Kelly, and I have a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old. I'm Becky. I have a 17-year-old, a 14-year-old, and an 11-year-old.
Really?
Hi, I'm Alice. My son is 4.5 in pre-K right now.
Hi, I'm Olga. My daughter is 2, professor.
I'm Nina. I have a daughter who's 7 in 2nd grade, a son who's 5 in kindergarten, and a 3-year-old in pre-nursery.
I'm Flip. We have 3 boys, 8, 6, and 3, and 3rd, 1st, and nursery.
And Regina, I have a 6-year-old son in 1st grade and an 8-year-old daughter in 2nd grade.
Hi, I'm Priya. I have a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, and Julia is 5. She's in kindergarten.
So a real range. We've got everybody with kids from pre-K all the way up through teens, older teens. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. And I have 2. I have an 8-year-old and I have an 11-year-old. So just started middle school in Westport, so it's always exciting, as you guys know. So social emotional learning, as it's defined by CASEL, which is the preeminent group in this field right now. That's the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning. They talk about 5 areas of social emotional learning that we're trying to support. So self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and problem and decision making. So those are the 5 big areas. And if you've been to some of the other sessions, we would have, heard me talk about some of those other areas. But today we're going to really dive into the work and the skill of self-awareness, which really, as we know, is a lifelong skill. It comes to be in childhood, right? And early childhood. But we're really talking about a lifelong skill that we're all continually working on. So it's, it's complicated. I am not a psychologist, but I hope that in this work today that maybe we'll come to sort of understand what kinds of things we can do as parents, what kinds of things we can do as a school to also sort of support our children's self-awareness and how it plays into learning. So just to get our minds going, coffee always helps. But thinking about what self-awareness is, like when I say self-awareness to you guys, what comes to mind? Feel free to just throw something out. What does self-awareness mean to you? And there's no wrong answer.
Knowing who you are.
Knowing who you are. Great.
Boundaries.
Boundaries,
Do you know how to act in a social setting and what the boundaries might be in a social setting? Your expectations.
Boundaries and expectations in a social setting.
Acknowledging your feelings.
Big one. Anything else?
To know what you want.
To know what you want. Great. Yeah. And that's to know what you want, to know what you need.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to bring up the definition according to Castle, and sort of broadly define self-awareness as being able to recognize and identify emotions. And we're going to get into all of these, but these are the three that they talk about as it relates to, specifically as it relates to learning. But possessing an accurate self-perception, so that includes both of our strengths and our limitations. So who are we? I think someone talked about that. Who are we? What are we all about? What are our strengths? What are some of our limitations? And having a well-grounded sense of optimism and a growth mindset, which I'm sure many of you have heard about or read about, this idea of the growth mindset. So that idea of self-awareness, of those three things, are so important to understanding who we are, and it actually impacts all of those other areas of social emotional learning, our self-management, our relationships, our decision-making. So knowing who you are and being able to do these things is really important. So self-awareness over time. I mean, I apologize because there's one more that I'll get to over here, but I think it's really fascinating to understand a little bit of the brain, and we'll go, that's actually one of the videos that I wanted to show you, but I think it's really amazing because there's so much research out there right now that supports so much of this work. But we know from, those of you who have preschoolers, that they are going through this massive understanding of who they are in terms of both of their physical and emotional awareness, right? The labelings of I versus we. And around age 5 is when children develop something called theory of mind, which is that I may feel something that might be different from what you may feel. So before this, a child may think that everyone shares their beliefs, right? We've all been there as parents. What do you mean you don't they don't understand that you may feel differently? And around age 5 is when that changes. So, for example, before that, if dad is upset, the child might give him a pacifier, right? Pacifier soothes me, it must soothe you too. So there's this idea of a theory of mind, which is to say that around that age is where children start to develop that sense of other people thinking differently than them. And elementary school, and then again in middle school, and in the years, the teen years, is when our brains really start to take off with this idea of our cortex and our prefrontal cortex developing. So that is really the part of our brain that controls so much of this work, our regulation skills that we talk a lot about when it comes to emotional regulation. But that really takes off during the elementary school years, and then again by reorganizing and shifting itself again in the teenage years. So understanding that development helps us understand where the kids are as they grow, and I think helps us with a little bit more, helps us understand them, helps us have a little more compassion for where they are and how they develop. So, and ways we can teach into that as well as parents and as teachers. Okay, so let's get into emotional awareness, or what's often called emotional literacy these days. I have some paper here, so we're just gonna, I think, my hope is that we have a little bit of fun with this activity today, and that it's like a workshop, so if you have questions or just comments, please feel free to just. This idea of the emotional vocabulary is really interesting to me, and if you've been to sessions before, we've talked about this a lot. But today I want to actually just try something out with you guys. So there are, and this was an amazing thing for me to actually learn, more than 3,000 words for emotions in the English dictionary. And yet, the question comes up, how many do we actually use? How many can we actually name? It's a really interesting sort of exercise. And so without judgment here, and you could do it with someone sitting next to you, you could do it alone, I'm going to give you guys just a minute to list as many words that you can, as many feeling words as you can name. And let's just see how many as a group we can come up with, just for the fun of it. So again, you can do it with someone next to you, you can do it by yourselves, but I'm going to give you a minute and let's see how many we can do. You guys ready? Go ahead. You can think about how you felt this morning. Knowing the holidays are coming up.
That's really an emotion.
That we see the emotion.
All right, let's stop there. So go ahead and just kind of look through your list. And maybe what we can do is just really quickly.
I noticed that too.
Maybe we can go around the circle two times and just say something. Say one of the words on your list, and we'll go around and we'll try not to repeat anybody else's and see what we come up with.
Happy. Confused. Defeated.
Sad.
Frustrated.
Anxious?
Elated.
Paranoid.
Excited.
Exhausted.
Yeah. So if you're comfortable over there, feel free to come and join us. Don't want anyone to feel out of the circle. It's the teacher in me. Like, I need everyone. Exhausted, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exhausted.
great.
Confident?
Grateful, is that emotion?
Mm-hmm.
Jealous. That's an emotion. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe let's see a question.
Yeah.
Nostalgic?
Great.
Overwhelmed?
Oh, enthusiastic.
Great. Okay, so let's stop there for a second. So how many of you got more than 10? Or around there? How many got more than 20? It's hard, right? I mean, it's funny. We think that we know. It's something we experience on a daily basis, and we experience many feelings all on a daily basis. And yet, when you actually try to name them, I know it's out of context here. I'm asking you in this sort of out of context environment, but at the same time, we think about the fact that there are 3,000 words for emotions in our English language, and yet the number that we can actually name is we struggle as adults to come up with 15 or 20 in a minute, right? And then we think about our kids, and we think, wow, if we find it hard to come up with those kinds of words, right, and to name those kinds of words, then what are our kids feeling, especially as they experience some of these emotions for the first time and don't understand what is going on? So the idea of expanding the emotional vocabulary is such an interesting one, because really, we can really look at ourselves and say, oh my gosh, how many do I know? How many can I name? And then how many can my children name? So it gets us really thinking about that idea of how we can do that. Another really interesting idea around this work is something that has come up. Mark Brackett is the director of Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and he's come out with a book which is really interesting called Permission to Feel, which I definitely recommend. Some of it is his work with the Ruler program, which is Yale's program for social emotional learning. But in general, it's much more than that, and it's certainly appealing for anyone who's interested in this work. And he talks a lot about the idea of being an emotion scientist or emotion judge. So, what is the difference between an emotion scientist and an emotion judge? When you think of a scientist, right? A scientist is somebody who's asking questions. Maybe a scientist is someone who's non-judgmental, right? Where you have somebody who's a judge who's going to deliver judgments. And so, as parents and as educators, we're often in a position where a child might be displaying some kind of emotion, right? He might be displaying some kind of behavior, but we have to ask ourselves, what is he really feeling inside? What is going on in there? Because maybe those actions, maybe those behaviors are not really matching what he's actually feeling. So as an example, I think about my son, and I might have told this story before, so I apologize if I have, but he was outside playing with some friends. This was when he was about 8 years old, and all of a sudden, and he's not particularly an aggressive child or anything, all of a sudden a fight started to break out in the middle of the yard. I didn't know what was going on, and there were 3 of them playing. I came outside and sort of pulled everybody apart, and he was fighting with his best friend, and he ran upstairs. And I said, what is going on? What's going on over here, guys? Anyway, we got them separated. I went upstairs to my son's room and started to, just sort of sat with him, trying to find out what is going on. And over time, in the conversation, I realized that actually what had happened was he was starting, there was a disagreement. The disagreement broke out into a physical argument, and then, or physical fight, and then he was actually feeling embarrassed about how it had blown up and how it had happened. But what he had displayed in the moment was this sort of angry, more violent kind of reaction to it all, but what he was actually feeling was embarrassment, which was a really new feeling in that kind of age group for him, right? Feeling of embarrassment about how he had acted towards his friend, with his other peers around. And so the behavior that he was showing was not matching what he actually was feeling. So this idea of becoming an emotion scientist or thinking about what might be behind our children's behaviors is so important, and thinking about how we as parents can be that scientist as opposed to the judge. Does that make sense? Yeah? Any thoughts? Or and it makes us go ahead.
But like, doesn't he still get punished? I mean, like.
Well, I think the question then becomes, what do you do with that information, right? But knowing more about the situation and what happened can help me as a parent help him, right? So there was anger, there was embarrassment, and it doesn't excuse what happened and how it was handled, but I can help him label those feelings for himself. And so when children actually have they talk a lot about name it to tame it, which is part of the idea of, understand having an array of feelings or having the vocabulary of feelings that you can talk through. The idea that you can name that feeling helps actually calm the side of the brain that is going through all of those big feelings. So if they can name it, they can tame it. Doesn't excuse it, and I think that's a really fine balance in there, because we don't want to excuse the behavior that happened. What happened and how he handled it was not okay, and that had to be dealt with. But his feeling had to be acknowledged in there as well.
The hope is that in the future, if he feels that feeling, he's not going to explode with what seems like rage,
Absolutely, and it's a very fine balance as a teacher, as a parent, what you excuse. And sometimes I think people look at this work and say, oh, well, if I'm just naming the feeling for him and saying that that's an okay feeling to have, does it excuse the behavior? And it doesn't. So there is a question around, well, that's the feeling that you're having, and that's an okay feeling to have. I understand why you're having that feeling, but it doesn't excuse the behavior for what or how you handle the situation, and let's talk about that.
Because as a parent, it's also, I feel like, very difficult when you have multiple children and they're fighting, and you can, because you've had these conversations with your children, you can say, okay, this one's actually feeling jealous, but it's coming out in, maybe some nasty words, or this one's feeling embarrassed, so he's getting aggressive, and then, and then actually discussing the behavior, and it's just, there's so many layers, it's just so difficult.
Yes, and it's, in a place that's calm, you have to find a place that's removed from those triggers, to then be able to go back and reflect on it, right? Because in that moment, they're not listening to reason, and they're not listening to reason in that moment. We have to de-escalate that emotion first, and de-escalate the situation before we can actually take that moment to look back and reflect with them about what happened, what they were feeling.
Yeah. It's almost like, from what I understand and having 3 kids, that you have to diagnose your emotion, so you're giving your child the tools so that they can identify what they're feeling and say, okay, I'm feeling this, and when you talk to them, so that way it doesn't manifest into something else, and then they can hopefully take a step back and think, okay, I talked to Mom about this is how I'm feeling, and this is maybe it's manifesting in this way. What can I do to change my behavior, or is there a solution? I mean, from that a scientific point of view, I try to educate my kids in that way, so that if they have a problem or if there's a scenario, that they can kind of be objective and remove themselves.
So in the moments, you mean when they
Not
can-
really, so that maybe in the moment that it could, before it escalates to that point, if it, the initial few times, you're not gonna be able to do that because it's so hard, even as adults. But if something's happening, that way that you can you can maybe think a little bit more consciously about it. Because if you make them feel secure and strong enough, then they will come and talk to you. They will feel that, okay, let me calm down, let me take a step back.
Yeah, and I think that's huge, is once you've given a child a sense of, this is what I might have been feeling, and let's think about how I can handle that next time. If I get that feeling again, then you've empowered them to handle the situation differently, handle the situation on their own, and it's going to take a lot of practice to get there, and they're going to make a lot of mistakes before that happens, but that moment of consciousness is really important.
And it makes them feel like you value them, and I think sometimes that's all they're looking for, is to feel that value and attention, and that someone's acknowledging their feelings or any emotion that they're going through.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. So, this is a really helpful video. I think that helps explain. It's just a 2-minute video that will explain the idea of how the brain works, which I think is actually incredibly empowering for kids and incredibly empowering for adults and parents to know as well. And just really speaks to it was there, wasn't it?
I don't know if cheese is the healthiest.
Nope. Oh boy. Let's see if I can do it. Maybe. Sure. Maybe I have to minimize PowerPoint.
Thing for dog.
But confused about. Thanks for what?
No, that's not it.
Kids want to know.
Sorry.
Imagine that.
Sorry, okay.
Kids want to know. Imagine that you really.
Oh, I'm sorry. I like it. I think it's this one, so that's.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up, representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull, the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
Okay, so that was, what is that? Oh my goodness. Okay, so that was Dan Siegel, who wrote The Whole Brain Child, which is a book I absolutely recommend if you haven't read it or if you are interested in learning more about the work going on inside the brain and how we can teach children about the brain. I think it's really fascinating, but it really speaks to this idea of what's happening from a very young age and how we can actually teach children about their brain and how, as parents, we can help support this idea of, flipping the young child, flipping their lid, and getting close to that boiling point, and then helping to bring it back with strategies so that we're all connected, or regulated, all connected, being the parts of the brain are all connected back again. So, there you go, there's the video. Maybe that will come back. But I'm gonna just go back to this mode. Seems to be taking off a sec. There we go. Okay. So, I know this idea that you mentioned actually of sort of helping kids kind of bring consciousness and awareness to that moment is so important. And I think mindfulness is a really interesting strategy. There's, of course, a lot of research these days around mindfulness and the work around children and mindfulness and supporting mindfulness in education. But really, when we think about it, mindfulness and the way it's defined is really about just paying attention to the moment and being aware of the moment. And I love this quote. It's by Meena Srinivasan, who's the author of SEL Every Day, which is a great book particularly for middle school in education. But she talks about how engaging in mindfulness can be an opportunity to bring a kind and curious attention to what we're experiencing in the moment. So when an emotion arises, we find out what it is. What am I feeling? Is it anger? Is it sadness? Is it frustration? And through engaging with the emotion in this way, the intensity of it lessens and we're able to manage strong emotions. So it helps us cultivate a curious attitude to our emotions. Why am I feeling this way? Why is our child feeling this way? Right? And helps us broaden our perspective and helps us to be less reactive. So we're really, and when we talk about self-regulation of these emotions, we're really, and in our own lives as well, trying to create that space between what that trigger is, right, and how am I going to react to it? What is the choice that I have? And as adults and as parents, we have lots of choices about how we're going to react. As kids, we need to help them. They need that support about creating that moment, that time between what the trigger is and what our reaction is going to be. And in that moment is where mindfulness plays a really interesting role. So it's a lot of work around around mindful parenting. And so, I certainly encourage you to look more at that. I think it's really interesting work and how we can help our children and help ourselves create this moment of space between our triggers and the reaction that we have. And it's interesting. Someone said, parenting is not is usually not an emergency situation. It's not an emergency, and we can use that idea of mindfulness to create this space between what the triggers are for our children, for us, and how we're going to react to that. Okay, so, we talked about emotional self-awareness, and that idea of emotional literacy, helping us become scientists, as opposed to judges, this idea of mindfulness. But now let's look a little bit at possessing an accurate sense of self, because this is something I think that really feeds into this idea of self-awareness, of course. So when we're trying to, how do we give our children that accurate sense of self, right? We want to instill in them a sense of self-confidence. We want them to have a really great knowledge of who they are, right? And what does that look like? What does that mean? So one thing that we talk a lot about is what are our strengths, right? What are our assets? What are our sea of strengths? And we have so many of them, and the children have so many of them. And that confidence in our strengths and our assets also comes from competence, right? So what can I do? What can I do at school? What can I do in my family? There's a lot of work these days around, for example, chores at home, right? And the idea being that if our children feel competent, they feel they can do things to contribute to the house, it's a really important skill and it builds their self-confidence. So if you're interested in that, the work by, some of you may have read How to Raise an Adult by Julie Haynes, I believe her last name is. Really great book. She was the dean of Stanford, and she wrote this book based on her experiences and the kids that she would see coming into Stanford University. And this idea of competence and of chores is something that is really in the literature right now about how important that is in terms of building children's self-confidence. But also, on the other side, is being reflective and accepting of our weaknesses, our struggles, right? And knowing when to ask for help. So just to take a moment, I think it's always easiest to reflect on ourselves before we're thinking about our kids, or maybe it's harder sometimes to reflect on ourselves before reflecting on our kids. But if we really think about it, our own strengths, right? What are the things that come naturally to you? What are the things that just come easily? For me, when I thought about this and I thought about the question that comes next, of what things come less naturally for me, sometimes that's an easier question to start with, right? Because we all, are pretty hard on ourselves about what doesn't come naturally, or what are my weaknesses, and what am I working on right now, and all of that. And it can be easy to stay there, right? Like, what are my challenges? And so there's a constant balance in our heads around what are the sea of strengths that I have, as well as what things may not come as naturally to me, right? And how do I know when to ask for help, which is a huge skill. So one of the things that doesn't come naturally to me is organization. That is a really hard thing for me. And I have multiple strategies around my house for keeping me organized, and my kids know a lot about them. So for example, when we first moved to our house, which was about 8 years ago, I would always forget, I'd leave the house and I'd always forget I'd always have to go back either for my keys or for the garage door to see if I had closed the garage door. And there was one more, and I just can't remember which one it was. Anyway, my kids, I said to them, I can't, this is so hard for mommy. Can someone make me a checklist? Which is something you do a lot. We do a lot with kids in schools who need some supports, right? Is give them a checklist. I needed that checklist. And so they made a checklist for me. My daughter made a checklist for me that went on the visor of of the car, so that before I left, I would remember to go through these 3 things. So there are so many supports that I have around the house. That's just one of them for my organization. But when you think about it, you think about things that come naturally to you and things that are challenges for you. You can probably, I'm not sure, I'm curious to ask where you guys are spending the most time right now in your head. If you're thinking more, if you're thinking more about the side or about the side, what comes more easily to you right now? Your strengths or your challenges? Challenges. So right, I think so too. It's very easy to stay here, and I think that this idea of seeing ourselves as who we are. There's a lot of expectations, of course, on kids these days to be perfect, right? To be good at this, to be good at sports or a sport, to be good at school, to be good at music classes, whatever they have going on in their life. It's almost this, it's an unrealistic expectation that we have of our children to be good at so many things. And of course, there's a lot of pressure as we get older, as they get older, to be good at so many things because we think colleges are looking at how they're evaluating our children based on so many of these things that they're doing, right? So there's so much pressure on them, and yet when we look at ourselves, we know intuitively that we have strengths and we have weaknesses, and that's the real world, right? That's a person. So when we think about our children, we have to ask those things of our kids. What are our children's strengths and interests, and what comes naturally to them? So if you have young kids right now, for those of you little ones, or not so little ones, when we're thinking about our kids' strengths and helping them pursue their strengths and their passions, that's what we're trying to find out, right? We're curious, what are your interests? Now, some kids, their interests are going to be their interest might be in soccer, right? Another child's interest might be in gardening. Whatever your child's strength is, whatever their passion is right now, is so important to helping them cultivate a sense of self-confidence in their exploration of that interest. So I really encourage that with the kids that I work with parents that I work with, because I think whatever your child's passion is where they want to get better, is where they will want to excel, and where they will have fun excelling. When we first moved to Westport, he was 4, and I said, sort of finding out about the neighborhood, and everybody said, oh, you must do soccer. That's a great thing for all the kids to do. They all love it. So I signed up Brady for soccer, and he didn't love it. And I thought, and here I was, a teacher, a parent, someone who knew about child development, and yet at the same time, I remember thinking, oh, but this is what all the kids are doing. I want him to do soccer. It's where everybody seems to be, and it seems to be a nice whole community of everyone doing soccer. And it took me a little time to realize my thought process here, that I wanted him to do soccer, but you know what? He actually really didn't want to do soccer at all. He was much more interested in arts, and he was interested in baseball. That's what he wanted to do. He didn't want to do soccer. Funnily enough, fast forward now, he's a 6th grader. Now he wants to be on the soccer team, and he wants to be a goalie. I mean, so your interests and the passions and where they are changes, right? But we have to really listen to our kids and think about where they want to be and what they want to do, and not what we want them to excel at. So how can I provide more opportunities to explore more of the same opportunities for my kids? If they're interested in piano, that's what they are really excited about. How can I take them to a piano concert, or just surround them with other ideas around music that they're interested in? Again, following your child's passion, your child's interest. How can I help them develop competence? So thinking about what they can do at home. If you're interested in chores and jobs you can give your kids, there are many resources out there which you can look at. But I really think that it's so important for kids to develop that sense of competence at home, whether it's making their beds, or taking out the garbage, whatever it might be. I mean, for me, it's one of my big things I know as a parent is making the bed, because it really is, it's something I feel like I just want the house to have beds that are made. But I have to step back after my son makes his bed, which he does on most days, and realize that he made the bed in a different way than I made the bed. But I can't correct it. I can't do anything to show him that he didn't make the bed the way that I wanted him to make the bed. Is this really a big deal for me? No, it's so much more important for me to know that he made the bed. It may not be exactly how I made the bed or how I wanted the bed made, but that's so important for him to develop that confidence in that, and just how we can help out around the house for both kids. So I really encourage that. What are some things that are difficult or challenging for them, and how do I encourage them to ask for help? So this idea of advocacy. So if your child needs some more support in math, or whatever subject that they feel may not be their strength, how do they ask for help? How do we support them in going to the teachers and saying, I need help with this, with adding 3-digit numbers or whatever it might be? That skill is so important, and I know especially if many of you guys who have older kids, they are expected to do that. There's a lot of expectation that they do that in the upper grades, and so building those skills and learning about who you are and saying, oh, you know what, that looks like, that looks tricky. Maybe you can go ask your teacher for help. What might that look like, right? How can I help support my child and him going to ask the teachers for help for something? Because that skill is something that's so important as they become later teenagers, and also then as they go off to college, right? Not everything is going to come easy to them, and how do I ask for what I need? Okay, and then the final piece of this equation of self-awareness, emotional literacy, to understanding yourself and having a good sense of yourself, to helping develop optimism in our children, is this piece around a growth mindset. And many of you might be familiar with the growth mindset work, and if you haven't, if you are not, Carol Dweck, who's a researcher at Stanford, is really the key leader in this field. And the results are really, her research is so compelling for us to understand, both as parents and as teachers. So let's see if this video might pop up. Give it a second, see if it will pop up, and if not, I'm not sure. I apologize, I thought it came through on the presentation. But the idea that, if you're not familiar with Carol Dweck's work, her research basically shows that that some people have what's called a fixed mindset, and some people have what's called a growth mindset. And that the idea that our skills, or that the the way we look at a task can really depend on the outcome of how we approach that task. So if someone with a fixed mindset, or for little kids what we call brick brain, right, is the belief that I just can't do it, right? As opposed to I can't do it yet. I can't do something yet. And that empowerment of knowing that you can do something over time and with practice and with effort is something that is so central to how we approach a task. Is really quite amazing and very compelling, and I so wish I could bring up this video. But I don't think I can,
But is this like kind of like a name it and tame it? If you find that one of your children has a fixed mindset, you keep telling them you can do it if you keep trying at something, you're going to like practice, just make you better at it, or you try to set them up for small tasks that you know they will succeed even though they're not sure if they will, but they're so resistant. I mean, I have a son who he's so resistant to try just staying in his bed till 6:30, but he stays in bed till 6:15. I'm like, you can do this. I'm trying to give praise and tell him that you can do it like with small rewards along the way, just so I can hook him, you know, and like be like, you got this, you know?
Absolutely.
And I wouldn't do that necessarily for the other kids who I know can, like, they don't need all that confidence, like, hand-holding.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And name it to team it is the idea of naming that feeling of what's going on, what is going on, and how am I feeling, and how can I use the name it to team it strategy.
Right, but it's not just the same as like repeating a phrase, like you can do it, if you practice, you can do it, you know.
Right, it's the idea of the growth mindset is more about how you may not know something now, but you can do this with the strategies and supports, and how might I support my child with those small steps along the way, like you said, whether it's tying their shoes, right? I can't do it. It's the frustration of like, I can't do it, or it's a math problem, right? And how can we give them those supports to say that they can do it with time, with effort, with practice. And one of the things that is really, I apologize, I was hoping it would just, usually there's a play button that just pops up, but it's not working, unfortunately. One of the things that they talk a lot about, and in that video it talks a lot about, is the idea of praise, right? How can we be very specific in our praise to help a child develop that growth mindset? So for example, if you say to a child, like, if you praise their smarts, if you say, oh, you're so smart at something, that child will actually go on to take less risk over time, and because they don't want to feel like they've been unsuccessful, exactly, that they failed at something. So the idea of praise and how we can praise the effort and the process as opposed to the result is so important to helping our children continue to work towards something that might be difficult, and allow them to keep taking risks, even if they have completed something successfully. So praising the effort, praising the process. I'm sure so many of you do this already, but keeping our eye on that goal of praising the effort and praising the process is so important to helping children develop this idea that they can do something with hard work, and that they can continually take risks to go out there and take on more challenges. So that is I apologize that that video can't be shown, but it's really a great thing to look up. I would definitely recommend reading or just looking up some of those videos on growth mindset, because there are quite a few of them out there, and the evidence is so compelling about how we can continue to help our kids develop those skills. So then the other idea around and then I think we'll sort of, this is just towards the end of the presentation, but this idea that we can encourage optimism in our children, right, and growth mindset is this idea of building resiliency, learning from mistakes, recovering from setbacks, and how do we do that? And the idea of normalizing setbacks and normalizing failures is so interesting to me as a teacher, because I felt like oftentimes in parent-teacher conferences I would say, especially with kids who tend to have more perfectionistic habits, like my daughter, for example, is to say, how do you as parents, how do we as parents normalize this? How do we make this something that is acceptable in our family? We might, and how do we do it in a way that's really visible to our children? Do we bring that up? Do we talk about it? Do we have conversations about it? There was a really interesting NPR segment with a woman who started Spanx, who's now a billionaire. Yes, and she talked about how in her family, she was one of a few children, and they would sit around the dinner table, and her father would ask them all, what were you not successful at today? What were you not successful at today? It's a big question, right? It's a hard question. It's hard for us to answer. We have to think about that kind of thing. But the idea of it, which I think is really interesting, is to really think about not just what we did that was successful, what was a good part of our day, but also what didn't go so well. And making that, like normalizing that, and actually bringing that into the conversation with our families is so important. So I encourage you to kind of think about that and think about how to make that visible with your kids. I think it's a really powerful thing to do.
What else did you ask? It couldn't have just been like what did not go so well. Like, is it what went so well, like a high and a low? Or?
Yeah, you can do it. I mean, sure. And that's the idea, is this balancing of strengths and our challenges. We don't want to spend all our time, right, talk about a heavy dinner.
Right, that went wrong, this went wrong.
Where shall I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, to think about that is balancing those things, balancing the strengths, balancing all the good things we felt
giving them the
well.
confidence that they know that they can come to you with what's wrong, that it's okay, because some kids are afraid of their parents to tell them what problems that they're having. They just put on a nice pretty face, and they just, they don't feel comfortable with their parents, and to let them know, I'm not doing so well in this area. And as a parent, you need to tell them, it's okay. Sometimes people have a bad day, you're going through a phase, but, it's okay.
And how to recover from that day, right? So, the idea is not to necessarily dwell on the failures, right? Because failure in itself doesn't teach us resiliency, right? It's about how we recover from those failures, how we, what strategies do I have to know that tomorrow might be different? Or how can I look at this in a different way? What is the strategy I'm going to use now to get back on track? So not just the failures, but...
What was the exact question again that she asked your father?
I think that
it was not too negative, but it was.
What were you unsuccessful at today?
What were you?
Or what's something that you tried that you feel like you did, that didn't go so well today? And before you leave, I hope if you guys can, maybe I can just ask you if you can pass around. I have some materials that I'd love to send on to you. So if you're interested in some articles and some other information, please feel free to just put your name and email, and then I'll just send out the information this evening. But I think you can follow that question up, right? It's like, what did you think about for yourself? What didn't go so well today? And does anybody have any ideas in your family for how I can think about this differently, right? It can be a problem-solving strategy with the family as well. I often do this with my husband, and I'll make things up. I mean, especially when the kids were little, just to show them, right? It doesn't, it's nice if it's something that's authentic, but if you have to make it up, make it up. That's what I say, because it's so important that our kids see that we are dealing with this too, and that it's a normal part of life.
Yeah.
Angela Duckworth, who wrote the book Grit, has something called the One Hard Thing Rule. And I always thought this was the book is fantastic if you haven't read it. It's a really, really great read.
One heart. What's the name?
Grit. 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 But she talks about doing the one hard thing rule as a family. So the idea is everybody chooses their one hard thing, this hard thing is your thing that you're working on, that everybody in the family has something they're doing. So in her example, her daughter plays piano, and that was the one hard thing that she chose to focus on. Another hard thing might be if you're running a marathon, if you're running your 5K or whatever it is, whatever goal that you set for yourself, it's something as a family that gives you an opportunity to say, we're all working on something. And it's going to be frustrating at times. And it's going to be frustrating for me, and it's going to be frustrating for you. But we can help each other. We can talk about how we're going to get back on track. We can talk each other through those frustrating moments and help each other. So I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it as a family. And then to monitor our self-talk. This one is so hard for us as grown-ups because it's so embedded. But when we think about making mistakes, right? Maybe it was a diet that didn't work out. Maybe it was a New Year's resolution where you were, struggling. What do you say to yourself in those moments? And how do we actually monitor that and for our children? So my mom, whom I love dearly, I can still remember those, and I remember this as a kid, when something didn't go right, I would hear her speak out loud, and she'd say, her name's Shirley, and she would say, Shirley, I can't believe you did that, that's so stupid. And she'd berate herself with these comments that were so harsh, that were so full of judgment. And I remember almost taking a step back as a kid and being, a little worried, that she held herself to such high standards that anything less than that was something that outwardly, verbally became like berate herself about what she did wrong. So monitoring our self-talk, thinking about that talk that we give ourselves and how we're modeling it for our children is so
you're here to avoid unhelpful or negative self-talk, or actually to have some sort of proactive, oh, that didn't work out, maybe I can think of a new, sort of a narration of the way we want them to see.
Of what we
and
want
think
them
about,
to see.
Yeah.
Exactly. So not that we shouldn't have self-talk, but what self-talk are we giving ourselves? And one easy way to practice this is to not start with the big moments, right? To start with the moments that that are a little bit more controlled. We break a glass. We forgot to load the dishwasher. Whatever it might be that was frustrating, and just starting small and just monitoring your self-talk and sort of turning it to the positive and saying, oh, I can't believe I did that. Next time I'm going to remember to turn on the dishwasher before I go to sleep at night so that I can empty it in the morning, right? Something as little as that just shows our children that how we handle that moment of frustration, right? And then it can go from there, and you can start to train. And what's amazing is when we think about the brain and how the brain changes, that self-talk has such an impact on our brains in those frustrating moments. So I think that starting small, at moments you can almost control, and then in those bigger moments, then it becomes a little bit more habitual for us to think about, what is our self-talk and what are we modeling for our kids. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So just some final thoughts. Self-awareness is one piece of this puzzle of social emotional learning, but it starts so young, and it really continues think that over time, if we work towards expanding our children's emotional awareness, building confidence in their strengths, but also recognizing their weaknesses or things that didn't come as naturally to them, and then helping to foster that growth mindset and that optimism is so important, is so critical, and it really impacts all of those other areas that we're talking about. So starting there, self-awareness, and really thinking about how that impacts your regulation skills, your relationship skills, decision-making skills is really so critical. So I hope I've given you some kind of, a framework to start, and I'd be happy, oh great, when we put in your emails so we can send out some information for further exploration of any of these topics.